As many of you know, Belarus is the image of Belarus that Lukashenko and his propaganda were depicting for many, many years was that the Republic of Belarus is the most Soviet of post-Soviet republics. And the history behind that is that Alexander Lukashenko, who is often being pictured by propaganda and himself and his competitors and independent media as well, is that he is the former head of the collective farm, the so-called kolkhoznik. But in reality, Lukashenko spent a large portion of his time working as a propaganda officer. He was doing this both in the army and within his civil occupation after he served in the army. So this image and the folklore of the Soviet propaganda has been a huge part of his identity, as well as a huge part of the people surrounding him. Meaning Lukashenko was born in the 50s, and just like the great majority of the people who work for the government or who represent the so-called governmental system in Belarus, he is the person who was upbrought by the Soviet standards, who was upbrought within the propaganda of the Soviet times that had a lot of stereotypes about what the Soviet Union was, and these stereotypes are being imposed on the Belarusian society since Lukashenko came to power during the last and the only so far democratic elections that took place in 1994. It's really important to understand that until August 2020, Belarus has been a country with somewhat double standards of identity. There's been an identity of the people who we might, for the purposes of this class, call the Soviet people, and the identity of the people who we might call pro-Belarusian or pro-European, who were less impacted by the Soviet propaganda, but also by Lukashenko's propaganda, which was a huge part of his state machinery. So by talking about this double propaganda, I would like to refer to the book by Nelly Bekos, which was published in 2010. And I think this book is the best explanation of what Belarus was until August 2020. It speaks about two alternative ways of Belarusianness, one official, the other one being alternative, or pro-Belarusian, as we call it. So the official identity is something that you could have seen in official television broadcasts, in official newspapers and radio stations. It's really important to highlight that the whole system of the so-called public media, which are being funded through public funds in the Republic of Belarus, have been effectively privatized or puppetized by Alexander Lukashenko in late 90s. And with this in mind, with this in mind, we should understand that the whole system of public media worked as the extension of Lukashenko's personal PR service. And the state-owned and publicly funded media were used to promote this so-called official identity, which was in many ways Soviet conservative, which was in many ways repeating the dogmas of Soviet ideology. However, at the same time, although the official propaganda was spreading the imagery of the official identity, in reality, Lukashenko is the person who has no ideology whatsoever. By this, I mean, at some point, he may pretend being a pro-European politician, which he very effectively used between 2014 and 2020 in the aftermath of illegal occupation of Crimea by the Russians and the war in east areas of Ukraine. Before that, he was playing the imagery of a person who was very pro-Soviet and who was very pro-Russian. In the aftermath of August 2020, he is forced to play the card of a person who is sticking to Russian identity. He is about to acknowledge the legal status of the occupation of Crimea, which he would probably never do simply to carry another influence tool on Vladimir Putin and to buy more and more debt and more financial resources from Russia in exchange to symbolic kisses, as we call them. Lukashenko is a person who is surrounded by individuals with very similar identity, and the system that he has built was created in a way where alternative identity, as we call it, very rarely had any chance to expose itself through public realm. And this is when we're coming to this love affair period between 2014 and 2020, when Lukashenko was playing the card of pro-Belarusian, pro-European politician, pretending to protect the sovereignty. And it was the time when the Belarusian society was experiencing what is sometimes referred to as liberalization, which de facto was not liberalization as such, but it was giving certain freedoms to NGOs and organizations that could operate within the realm of cultural initiatives, research initiatives, and so on. However, the political institutions and alternative political groups were repressed within the whole period of his rule since 1994, I'm sorry, and the same was the situation with independent media. So Lukashenko is not just not exposed to the alternative Belarusianness, which is pretty similar to the identity of people in the Baltic countries. I would say less similar to the identity in Poland, since Belarusian society is a lot less religious than the Polish society. And within this love affair period between 2014 and 2020, alternative groups were able to promote the message of pro-European character that is really a part of Belarusian history. And this period was one of the reasons the rebellion or the peaceful revolution, depending on which side represents the version of the events, has become possible in August 2020. The identity that was raised within these slightly 6 years gave people hope that there's a chance that the authoritarian government that would face the reality and realize that it has no support among the general population would step down. The people of Belarus had certain expectations that the surrounding of Alexander Lukashenko and foremost the most Soviet conservative groups, including the police and the army to a lesser extent, would choose the side of the people and would force Lukashenko to step down. This didn't happen, and what we are experiencing now is the process of radical wiping of this pro-European and pro-Belarusian identity in the interest of Russian identity and Soviet identity that propaganda promotes. We may clearly say that Lukashenko still has certain support, according to sociological studies of, let's say, Chatham House or Zayos Center from Berlin. Although in authoritarian society, sociology is experiencing troubles because each and every person who represents a sociological organization is being treated by individuals as the agent of the regime. This forces people to give the answer which is the safest. For instance, if, let's say, in the Soviet times, people were to answer the question about their attitude to Joseph Stalin, they would most likely say Stalin is the greatest ruler in the world and just safely leave, rather than say, I think we're either having questions or someone has to switch off their microphone. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you. However, the other alternative was to say that to say what people really think about Stalin and expect a little black car standing at the entrance of their building in the next few hours to take them to Gulag, if we simplify it to that. So whenever there's sociology in Belarus that says that Lukashenko has this and that percentage of support, we have to clearly understand that the answer that people within current pre-totalitarian regime give to sociologists are often the safest response implied by these individuals. So even within the atmosphere of fear and repressions, according to numerous sociological studies, Lukashenko has 30% of support at the top of it, meaning we should remember about this sociological bias in authoritarian and totalitarian societies. All that brings us to the understanding that the events of August 2020 were comparable to peaceful revolutions in Czechoslovakia in '68, to peaceful revolutions in the Baltics, to peaceful protests and protest movement in Poland in '70s and '80s. And this is indeed, I'm mentioning August 2020, this was indeed the moment that we might call the point when the pro-European and pro-Belarusian nationalistic, in a good way, ideology and identity took over the Soviet identity that was, if not dominant, then comparable in numbers of supporters to alternative identity throughout Lukashenko's rule. August 2020 was indeed a moment when Belarusians have realized their connection to nation. It was the moment when there was indeed a large wave of interest to national history, national language, national symbols. But first and foremost, the nationalism that we talk about in Belarus is the nationalism that puts citizenship and the rule of law and abiding by the rule of law above ethnic origin. Although there is a certain negative sentiment to Middle Eastern people and foreigners that look different in general, within 30 years of independence, with large influx of international students from abroad, there has barely been ethnic or racial-based conflicts or major incidents reported, which is pretty interesting for our region, and which is pretty interesting based on the amount of anti-Semitism that was widespread in the Soviet times. Surprisingly, Belarusians agree to, at least now, agree to treat as citizens not the people who speak Belarusian or who speak Russian or who look like Belarusians, but the people who abide by the Belarusian laws. And the request for the rule of law is one of the dominant needs of the population at the moment. There is growing interest in politics, which started slightly 18 months ago. And in the long run, we may say that what Belarusian society is experiencing now is a test for survival to a certain extent, but it's also a test for maturity. Whether the people are ready to get self-organized, whether they are ready to protect their identity that they have recently rediscovered to a great extent, because until August 2020, the issue of national identity was not a major problem for the majority of the population. And although we record the growing interest and the growing support for this, let's call it national identity, the situation with the official Belarusianness is becoming a lot more disturbing for its supporters and its leadership, by which I mean Alexander Lukashenko and his immediate subordinates, since the use of violence by the secret services, especially in August 2020, recorded reports of the use of torture and indeed really severe cases of torture. The use of weaponry against civilians, which was the first case of such nature since 1944 in the Republic of Belarus in that scale. I would remind that no weaponry was used against, or live weapons were used against the civilians when Belarus was quitting the Soviet Union in the 90s. And the social agreement that Lukashenko had with the Belarusian society was grounded on a few foundations, with one of the main of them being the so-called stability, which was understood as the basic income that each and every person could receive, but also the very basic set of social services and social securities that the government could provide at the time. And stability implied that Belarus is a country where civilians will remain safe until they get engaged into politics, into the criticism of Lukashenko's regime. And with growing interest in politics in 2020, it became clear that the majority of population is indeed involved into politics, as each and every aspect of life has become political. And this brings us to the point which was not originally believed to have any political impact on Belarusian identity or the revolution, and by this I mean the coronavirus pandemic. Belarusian government ran by Alexander Lukashenko was promising through this informal social contract with the society that people will receive basic guarantees within the medical system and will have basic access to medical services. With the beginning of coronavirus pandemic, Lukashenko did not just deny the pandemic itself, but also created the conditions when people willing to support doctors were, if not treated as enemies, but were facing certain suspicion and certain problems with their work from the side of the nomenclature and state security. The rise of volunteer movement that was created in the very first days of the pandemic, when it became clear that the government will not respond to it, has indeed become the prototype of the political self-organization that Belarusian society witnessed in the next 4, 5, 6 months before the elections took place. It was indeed a very unexpected move because nobody thought that volunteering was a big deal for Belarusians. Nobody thought that Belarusians would ever be interested in politics, and nobody really expected that the government led by Alexander Lukashenko may ignore a major problem related to the virus that affected people in little way or impacted their health seriously. It was indeed one of the greatest mistakes conducted by the Lukashenko regime. And until today, we see that Lukashenko denies the size of the problem. The medical statistics are undoubtedly being falsified, just like the results of the elections. But if only people could accept, to a certain extent, the falsifications during the elections, in the last 20-something years, the falsification of information about the coronavirus that was killing people and that was indeed ripping the social contract between the government and the society was the final drop that really started the revolution and that really started the rise of the civil movement, the movement for civil rights. In a way, we must say that the infrastructure for the revolution was built through changes in identity, and it was built through changes in public perception of the value of human life. This is one of the fundamental differences that current government and Belarusian society have. And in a way, Belarusian society is admiring the ideals of humanism, and by that I mean European tradition of humanities and attitude to human life. In May 2021, I guess, May 2020, famous political activist, or should I say political consultant Vitaly Shklarov, in his publication for CNN, wrote that the coronavirus is becoming the new Chernobyl for Belarus. By that he meant the reaction that the Belarusian government had to coronavirus, which was indeed comparable to the lies that the Soviet government promoted after the explosion in Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which affected Belarus greatly, and which was one of the reasons Belarusians were unhappy about the Soviet politics in late 80s. With this in mind, we may say that the national identity was indeed growing in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. It was, I would say, it was something that we might call the catalyst of the process. But the greatest deal of the nation building or the identity building started with Russian aggression against Ukraine. Although I would say nobody really expected that this revolution would somehow affect Belarusians in a major way. The occupation of Crimea and the beginning of war in East Ukraine made Belarusians care about their identity, and it really sparked the rise of cultural initiatives promoting the difference between Russian society and Belarusian society. While Russian society was fully supportive of the actions against Ukraine, Belarusian society was more reluctant to support military operation in Ukraine, but also was very reluctant to support the participation of Belarusian soldiers in any foreign military operation. It's important to highlight that in addition to the social contract that included basic income and healthcare services, the social contract between Lukashenko and Belarusians also included a point that Belarusian soldiers will never participate in any military conflict, foremost on foreign soil. And this fundamental issue was questioned in 2014 after Russian annexation of Crimea. And it was the first time when Belarusians, since the times of independence, thought whether there's a real chance of local soldiers participating in foreign military operation. It didn't happen, but in exchange, people became more detached from Russia, and this trend became even bigger in the aftermath of last year's elections, mostly because Vladimir Putin publicly supported Alexander Lukashenko. And I believe that by this, Vladimir Putin made one of the greatest mistakes in his foreign policy targeting the Republic of Belarus. although Belarusians were very supportive of Russia, and it's an undeniable fact, until 2020, the general understanding was that it's better to have a local dictator rather than be occupied by a foreign power. So people were suspicious of Russia, but they were generally friendly to Russia. After Putin supported Lukashenko, who was already known for what his security forces did, and I would remind you that dozens of thousands of people were detained in the first few days of protests. There were a few thousand cases of torture reported. There was the concentration camp, which we might alternatively call the internment camp, built in Slutsk, a small town in, I think, Minsk area, in Minsk region. But after the information about this camp became known to the general public through Radio Liberty publication, which was a great shock. With all these things in mind, Vladimir Putin decided to support the guy who was not just unpopular, but who currently was proven criminal, who conducted the military coup to continue his authoritarian rule, which at some point turned into what we might identify as sultanism or para-fascist regime or personalistic junta based on the options that you have on your table. So I think that it was one of the greatest discoveries for the people to, surprisingly for some, realize that the Kremlin is supporting a person who caused the greatest crisis in the history of independence, but who also is responsible for the crimes unseen in Belarus since the times of Stalinist purges. When we talk about the scale of repressions that took place in Belarus within the last 14 months and extrapolate them to a country like the United States, for instance, if only the repressions of the same scale took place in America, over 1 million people would go to jail in just first few weeks of the crisis, which is unbelievable size for scale of repressions for this country. But for a small country like Belarus, it indeed affects the whole society. And at some point in the aftermath of August 9 elections and the disturbances that followed, the number of arrests that took place over 24 hours was bigger than the number of people arrested on a daily basis in times of Stalinist purges. These events indeed became the borderline between old Belarus and new Belarus, between the country that we all knew and the country that Belarus has turned into by facing the tragedy of a scale that was unprecedented for the whole generation of people who lived in independent republic. When we speak about this new political mythology, and we clearly understand that each and every country is not just a perception of the country, but it's a perception of images about this country and perception of political myths about this country. So New Belarus, which is the side opposing Alexander Lukashenko, I would use this term because it's generally widespread among the supporters of changes. So the supporters of New Belarus require real political participation. They require the establishment of the rule of law, and they require the establishment of the government that would be inclusive, that would be based on the real will of the major population, and that would make the pursuit of criminals possible. At the same time, this mythology is grounded on the heroic examples of protest, which was deliberately peaceful. Indeed, there's been a few minor cases of self-defense violence that was used around August 11th to August 13th to protect the barricades in Minsk. And although these installations were generally referred to as barricades, these were symbolic installations from like street furniture and stuff like that to protect people from being shot at, to protect them from stun grenades. They were not very effective. And the problem with Minsk is that the city was planned in a way which indeed makes civil rebellion, if the revolution turns into civil rebellion, really difficult, mainly because of the way the infrastructure is being built, because of the large amount of open spaces, which make any opposition hard in central areas of the town. At the same time, it makes the capital of Minsk easy to block for the state security, and state security had 27 years of experience in blocking major political protests. A combination of these factors makes it really, really difficult for the people to run frontal assault, as we might say so, which, for instance, happened in Ukraine in 2014 in Maidan Square. So people have chosen to push for the peaceful changes, which I guess in the long term is indeed a better option for Belarusians. And I would like to mention Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who controversially said that the fact that the Soviet troops dismissed the Prague Spring in '68 turned the desire of Czechoslovak people into a dream. Although people were unable to establish democratic rule in '68, they were infected with the desire to build a country that would be a country of their dreams. And I think in a certain philosophical way, the fact that Lukashenko reacted to the deliberately peaceful protest in an extremely violent way gives the people not just hope, but also a dream or a myth of an ideal country that will be built on certain foundations like the rule of law, democratic rule, inclusion, and so on and so on. So although in the short run, it is clear that the civil society is destroyed, there is a growing interest for political participation. Against all odds and against all risks that people might bear, there is indeed growing interest in political studies. There is indeed growing interest for political life itself, because until August 2020, very few people could name the remember the name of the prime minister or the minister of interior, or knew about the facts of repressions that were indeed taking place. The repressions that we're observing now are a very condensed collection of the crimes that were taking place in Belarus within all 26, 27 years of Lukashenko rule, but the society seems to not notice that. So in a way, the experiences of last year and the build-up of this mythology of New Belarus makes Belarusian society in a way similar to the society of Czechoslovakia after the violent crackdown on local people in '68, when the Soviets dismissed the effort to start democratic reforms. I would say that without Russian support, Alexander Lukashenko is unable to sustain his political power in the long run. And what I mean by political support is not just the ability to say that Lukashenko is endorsed and recognized by Russia as a legitimate leader. It's also a political desire and political will of Russian elites to continue trade with Alexander Lukashenko and related companies. Russian market is indeed playing a great role in Belarusian exports. It's making up nearly 50% of all exports of the Republic. And if only Russian Federation closes its territory for exports from the Republic of Belarus, this would indeed be the end of the regime. However, there are still no reasons to believe that Vladimir Putin might do that in the next few months, just because Lukashenko remains one of his last allies in the former Soviet space, but also because Vladimir Putin, being a former state security or KGB officer, is built up in a certain collection of Soviet mythology, which is, however, different from the Soviet mythology that Alexander Lukashenko shares. While Lukashenko is a purely the child of ideological upbringing, Putin is a child of the state security ideology, which makes him a person who thinks in a way which is very different from Lukashenko's opinions. Putin was raised in a city. Lukashenko is a person who is detached from urban culture, just like the majority of people around him. It also impacts their vision of the world around them. While Putin was somehow exposed to the rest of the world, Lukashenko barely left the territory of Belarus as an adult and as a child. In 2019, he claimed that he served in border security guards in Moldova. However, there are no written facts that prove that so far. And this only experience is very likely the only exposure that Lukashenko had to places outside of the Soviet Bielorussia, as it was back in the days, the socialist republic. It makes really difficult for Putin to refrain from further support to Lukashenko, because it will be really hard for him to find another politician who understands him so much, but also to find a politician who is so wildly attached to the ideology of Russian world and who can help Putin gain his interest in Russia, which is not just economical interest of Kremlin-related oligarchs, but also the somewhat paranoid interest of Vladimir Putin to sustain the security of Moscow in Eastern European plain. Belarus is the shortest way to Russia from within Europe. It is the easiest way to Moscow. It's a plain land which has no natural barriers, or almost no natural barriers, that could have stopped any act of aggression from NATO or the European Union, which Putin is afraid of because of his state security background. And this is indeed causing a major problem for Belarusians. Putin will be supporting the politician who can assure him that no NATO forces will ever end up in Belarus, and no NATO forces will have an opportunity to easily get the passage from Europe to Moscow. It might sound a little bit paranoid, it might sound a little bit crazy for the people of our age, who totally understand that there are no interests whatsoever to attack Russia in an act of aggression and to occupy Moscow by NATO countries. But these beliefs are still strong in the former Soviet republics. And with the rise of Vladimir Putin's expansionist policy, which started around 2008 as a response to his unhappiness with the West. I would remind you that in late 90s and early 2000s, Russia seriously discussed participation in NATO, and there was a chance that this country might join NATO, but at some point Putin has understood or got the perception that he is not being treated by the West as equal, and with this grievance that he had, he started opposing the West in the worst way that we see in expansionist policy of Russia, with its armed attack on Georgia, with its armed attack on Ukraine, and with the support of Alexander Lukashenko in the aftermath of last year's election. Where does it bring us, and what might be the future? It is clear that at the current scale of repressions and at the current scale of escalation that Lukashenko exercises in the last 14 months, the Belarusian society might at some point end up into a completely burnt down ground, with no national identity, with no belief in the future, and with very little changes for transformation. And by that, I mean peaceful transformation. The Belarusian society is responsible for its future by itself. Although there was long hope for the West, it is clear that by merely applying sanctions and by applying sanctions that are not effective in a way, and I'm talking foremost about the sanctions of the European Union, not the United States, the West is given very little impact on the internal situation and the transformation of the Belarusian society. It is the responsibility of the society, but just like with all peaceful social transformations in Central and Eastern Europe in 1980s and 1990s, it is important to understand that no movement for civil rights, and by that I also mean Polish solidarity, was run merely by people inside the country. Each and every social movement had its support from the outside, because the resources that the society has are not always comparable to the resources that authoritarian and not to say totalitarian government may have. This brings us to an assumption that if Belarusian society itself does not take the responsibility, is not self-organized, and does not act by itself to sustain and support the idea and the belief in the country that matches their perception of how it should really be, this country may end up in a very sad place that will become the greatest gray zone of all of Europe. We see with the latest escalation of migration crisis that Lukashenko is seeking for an open military conflict with the West, and he is seeking for Russia's involvement into this conflict. So there are two things that remain uncertain. Will the West react to acts of aggression by Lukashenko? And what would Russia do in case European countries and their transatlantic partners choose to respond to Lukashenko's aggression against Poland or Lithuania. Lukashenko is using the strategy of mirroring actions. By this I mean he and his subordinates, as well as propaganda, rebroadcast the messages of the West that were used by the West to explain what's happening in Belarus. So now Lukashenko is calling names to government of Poland and Lithuania since the very beginning of his own political crisis inside the country that he ran. Lukashenko was promoting the idea that peaceful protests against rigged election were indeed an act of aggression from Poland and Lithuania, who planned to intervene into the territory of Belarus and occupy Brest and Grodno region. This is absolutely crazy idea, but it surprisingly works with people from the police and army who indeed believe that both Poland and Lithuania were about to attack Belarusian cities and occupy part of this territory. So it is indeed a really difficult situation. It is indeed the crisis that is probably the hardest challenge for the region, I mean internationally, since, if not 1944, then since early 90s, when the Soviet Union was attacking border guards of newly established Lithuania. But to a great extent, it depends on the self-organization of people inside Belarus and their belief in the great cause and in political will of the collective West. Can we say that Europe is reacting effectively? I wouldn't say so. It is effective to a matter that provides security to European citizens, but from the standpoint of people inside Belarus, it's the response of the European Union seems weak, late, and not effective. This helps Lukashenko build up his image of a tough guy with, as his propaganda says, iron nuts. And it's a challenge that the Western society is experiencing and will experience at even greater extent, mainly because the internal political crisis is now splitting into the political crisis that affects the societies in Poland, the society in Lithuania, but also the European Union overall. The goal behind the migration crisis is to create a situation when the citizens of democratic countries like Poland and Lithuania will assume that the government is too weak and too ineffective to provide the response that is necessary. And Lukashenko's goal is to turn both Poland and Lithuania into, if not authoritarian countries, then into countries with the public institutions that are a lot more weakened, and to jeopardize the establishment of democratic institutions in both of the countries. Although the situation with Lithuania is causing more concern, mainly because Lithuania is a small country and it's a lot easier to affect it economically and politically. With Poland, the situation is different because of the growing, well, you know the circumstances even without me.